Mrs. Mercer, you and your husband need to vacate this cabin immediately. It's an unauthorized dwelling and fines start today. Karen Whitfield's voice carried the smug certainty of someone used to crushing neighbors with paperwork and threats. She didn't even blink as she shoved the violation notice toward Emily's belly, swollen under her summer dress. I didn't flinch. I let her words hang there, thick as smoke, before answering. Funny thing, Karen. You might want to double-check your bylaws, because the county clerk still has my stamp on every load-bearing beam in this place. The shift was instant. Her eyes flickered just for a second, as if she realized she'd just swung at someone who'd already measured the ground beneath her feet. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I straightened, sliding the notice back into her hands. Name's Daniel Mercer, structural engineer, contractor, and the man who rebuilt this cabin from the foundation up. You may think you're dealing with another resident scared of late fees and liens. You're not. This land's been in my wife's family for 3 generations. I know every inch of it, inside and out. My tone stayed calm, but my chest burned with something deeper than defiance. Because this wasn't about fines or bylaws. This cabin was the last piece of Emily's father. He carved the oak rocking chair on the porch with his own hands, sanding it until his palms bled, promising her it would always be waiting. He died last year, weeks before we found out she was pregnant. She clung to that chair on the nights her morning sickness hollowed her out, rocking slowly, whispering to a child not yet born. And now Karen wanted her out, wanted us out, as if a line in a binder outweighed a man's legacy. I could see Emily's knuckles whitening on the railing, her eyes shimmering with quiet panic. My jaw set. No amount of smug boardroom politics was going to erase that chair, that cabin, or the promises woven into its walls. This wasn't just property, it was memory, it was sanctuary. And it was the one place my unborn child had already claimed as home. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. So, I looked Karen dead in the eye, my voice steady. You've chosen the wrong person to corner. I don't bluff and I don't break. This cabin is legal, and I'll prove it. Where are you watching from? Because the fight that started on that porch was only the opening shot. What Karen didn't know was that her violation notice wasn't a weapon. It was the rope she'd just wrapped around her own feet. And when the courtroom lights hit, she'd be the one standing in silence, exposed. I watched Karen retreat down the gravel path, her heels clicking against the stones like she owned every inch of timber ridge. She didn't look back, didn't need to. She thought she had planted fear in us, and fear was her favorite fertilizer. But as her figure disappeared around the bend, the silence left behind wasn't fear. It was the weight of something darker, the realization that she'd done this to others before. The next morning, I walked the narrow stretch of road that looped around the reservoir. Cabins and houses hugged the shoreline, their porches stacked with kayaks and coolers, their lawns meticulously trimmed. It was a Saturday, and the sound of weed trimmers buzzed through the air. Everyone kept busy here, but no one made eye contact. That was the first sign. A community this tight should have felt alive, not silent under the shadow of a single woman's clipboard. At the small dock near the community center, I found old Mrs. Hargrove struggling to carry a basket of laundry back to her place. I offered a hand, but she shook her head quickly, murmuring, "Don't get involved." The words struck like a warning shot. Her eyes darted toward the HOA office across the street, a converted lakeside cafe that now bore steel blinds and a brass plaque with Timber Ridge Lakefront Association etched like scripture. Inside the center, a corkboard sagged with laminated notices, fines for unmowed grass, warnings for unauthorized structures, even a threat of foreclosure pinned like a trophy. As I scanned the papers, patterns began to emerge. Different names, same tactics, always vague violations, always escalating threats, always ending in a signature from Karen Whitfield. I pulled my phone out, taking photos, cataloging everything. Professional expertise wasn't just about beams and joists. It was about seeing structure where others saw chaos. And what I saw was a pattern of systemic abuse disguised as governance. This was the skeleton of her control. Emily's voice echoed in my mind, soft but steady. If she can do this to us, she'll do it to anyone. That was the heartbeat of the fight, not just protecting our cabin, but tearing away the fear that silenced this neighborhood. As I stood by the bulletin board, the front door creaked open. Two men in Timber Ridge maintenance polos stepped in, their conversations cut short when they saw me. One of them, a tall man with a worn ball cap, paused long enough to glance at the notices in my hand. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He just moved past me, his shoulders stiff. That silence was familiar. It wasn't loyalty to Karen. It was survival. I stepped outside, letting the morning sun burn against my shoulders, and took in the sweep of the lake. Boats drifted lazily in the distance, but here, on land, everyone moved like pieces on Karen's board, and I realized then, this wasn't just my family's battle, it was a system built on intimidation, and I had just stepped into the middle of it. Back at the cabin, Emily sat in the rocking chair, her hands folded across her belly. She looked at me with eyes that asked the only question that mattered. "Are you sure?" I nodded, because hesitation here would be surrender. "This isn't just about us anymore," I said, my voice steady. "She's built a fortress out of fear. But every fortress has cracks. I just need to find them." The victory strategy wasn't some secret weapon hidden in a garage. It was the truth, buried in plain sight. My training taught me how to read pressure points in steel, how to calculate where stress would make something fail. Karen's empire was no different. The HOA office, the notices, the silence of my neighbors, every piece of it formed a structure. And structures, no matter how intimidating, always had a point where they buckled. I walked back out to the porch, letting my hand rest on the oak chair. Its grain was rough under my fingertips, steady like the man who carved it. Emily's father never bowed to storms or setbacks. And I wouldn't bow to Karen Whitfield, because this wasn't her community to control. It was ours to reclaim. The next day the sun slid low over the lake, painting Timber Ridge in amber light as I made my way toward the gated entrance. The guardhouse stood at the edge of the community, a squat brick building with tinted windows and a barrier arm that lifted at the press of a button. I had passed through countless times, but now I walked, determined to see the man who had become Karen's silent enforcer. Matthew Crane sat inside the guardhouse, shoulders squared, jaw set. He was in his late 50s, his sheriff's badge long retired, but still clinging to him in posture and presence. The faded uniform polo he wore looked more like a costume than clothing, stretched over a man who once carried real authority. He glanced up when I approached, and for a second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "Evening, Daniel," he said, voice flat, like the words were pressed out of him. His hand hovered near the logbook, but he didn't write my name. He just tapped the pen against the paper, again and again, the rhythm betraying nerves his face refused to show. I leaned on the railing, keeping my tone even. "Karen came by yesterday. Tried to push Emily out. She did it with you standing right there, didn't she?" His eyes dropped, just for a beat. His shoulders tightened and the pen stilled. Then he cleared his throat, shifting in the chair. "I don't make the rules. I just make sure people follow them." But his body told a different story. The way his foot tapped against the floor, restless. The way his gaze kept sliding toward the lake, as if he could lose himself in the water rather than face me. I let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. Finally he rubbed his temple, fingers trembling against weathered skin. "Look, Daniel, I saw how shaken she was. Your wife." That's not what I signed up for. His words cracked, though he tried to hold them steady. He shifted again, arms folding across his chest like a shield, but his grip was too tight, too defensive. I didn't press him harder. Men like Matthew weren't moved by threats. They were moved by conscience, and I could see his was already tearing at him. "You spent decades upholding the law," I said quietly. "You know intimidation when you see it. You know the line between order and abuse." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. His gaze darted to the corner of the guardhouse where a camera sat, its lens glinting in the fading light. He tugged at his collar, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You think you can take her down? You better have more than righteous anger. Karen's got the board wrapped around her finger. She's got neighbors too scared to breathe without her permission." His hand clenched around the pen, knuckles pale, but then loosened as though he regretted the force. I could see it, the fracture in his loyalty. Not shattered, not yet, but weakened by shame. His silence the night before had eaten at him, and it showed in every fidget, every unfinished sentence. "I don't bluff, Matthew," I said, "and I don't break. I'll find the cracks. When I do, the whole thing comes down. You'll have to decide if you're standing with her or standing with what you swore your badge meant." He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling hard through his nose, staring at the logbook like it might give him answers. His leg bounced, heel tapping against the floor in restless rhythm. Finally, he muttered, "You didn't hear that from me." His voice was quieter now, almost swallowed by the hum of cicadas outside. I stepped back from the guardhouse, the barrier arm rising automatically as if pushed by an unseen hand. Matthew didn't look up as I passed, but his posture slumped, shoulders sagging under invisible weight. The body of a man caught between orders and conscience. The fight was widening, and I wasn't alone anymore, not completely. Even if he couldn't admit it yet, Matthew Crane had already chosen his side. His struggle was written all over him. I left the guardhouse with Matthew's silence heavy in my chest. His words hadn't been a confession, but his body had spoken louder than any oath. He was cracking under the weight of Karen's games, and cracks always meant pressure points. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk had settled, and the porch light cast a weak glow across the rocking chair. Emily sat there, her hands folded protectively over her stomach, watching me approach. "She's not done," Emily said softly. She didn't need to explain who. I nodded, because we both knew Karen's brand of control. She didn't back down after one push. She doubled it. The proof arrived the next morning. A letter taped to our front door, the words printed in bold like a warning flare. Immediate penalties will accrue at a rate of $500 per day. For unlawful occupancy, eviction proceedings pending. The signature at the bottom was a flourish of arrogance. Karen Whitfield, President. I took the notice inside, laying it flat on the kitchen table. Emily leaned over it, her face pale, lips pressing tight. $500 a day, she whispered. "She's trying to bleed us out before the baby even comes." "She thinks fear will drive us out faster than paperwork," I replied. But fear was her weapon, not mine. Mine was truth. And truth had structure, like steel beams buried under concrete. Later that afternoon, I made my way to the Timber Ridge Community Pavilion. It was meant to be a place for cookouts, barbecues, and holiday gatherings, but now it served as a stage for Karen's announcements. Flyers for the next board meeting were pinned to the walls, each one stamped with rules about community standards. Residents drifted in and out, their conversations hushed, their glances quick. No one lingered. As I walked inside, I felt their eyes on me. Some offered faint nods of recognition, others looked away. Fear was thick in the air, the kind that silences voices before they can rise. It was the same silence I'd seen on Matthew's face. Karen's newest escalation wasn't just aimed at me, it was a signal to everyone else. She wanted to make me an example. If Daniel Mercer, the engineer with county certifications and a pregnant wife, could be cornered, then no one else stood a chance. I studied the notice board again, this time with sharper focus. Every letter from Karen followed the same template. Excessive fines, threats of foreclosure, warnings of eviction. And at the bottom, her signature like a stamp of fear. To anyone else, it was just paper. To me, it was a blueprint of abuse, and blueprints could always be deconstructed. Behind me, a father tugged his daughter toward the door, whispering, "Don't get noticed." His words echoed Mrs. Hargrove's warning from days before. Everyone here lived with their heads down, waiting for the next notice. That silence had become Karen's fortress. I took out my phone and snapped photos, capturing dates, fines, and threats. My training had taught me to see patterns in load-bearing walls, to find weak joints and structures others thought were solid. And what I saw now was that Karen's entire campaign was built on intimidation without legal foundation. No citations from county code, no references to state housing law, just the language of authority, wielded like a weapon. Back at the cabin, Emily ran her fingers along the edge of the new violation notice, then looked at me. "You're going to fight this, aren't you?" I met her eyes. "I don't have a choice." I folded the letter, sliding it into a binder where the photos of the other notices waited. Each one was another piece of the structure I was mapping out. She thought she'd trap me in a tightening circle of fines, but all she'd done was hand me the schematics of her own collapse. That night, as the crickets sang outside and the rocking chair creaked gently under Emily's weight, I wrote a simple truth across the first page of the binder. Fortresses fall from within. Karen had escalated the fight, but she'd also revealed the blueprint of her power. And blueprints once exposed never lie. The binder sat heavy on the kitchen table, its pages filled with photos, notices, and the pattern of a regime masquerading as governance. But I knew photographs and signatures alone wouldn't cut through the wall Karen had built. If I wanted to crack her fortress, I needed something undeniable, something official that stripped her authority bare. The next morning, I drove into the county seat, the road winding down from the mountain toward the courthouse square. The building rose in pale stone, flanked by weathered columns that seemed to hold the weight of more than just walls. This was where truth lived on paper, where authority came not from intimidation, but from record. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of old books and toner ink. Rows of filing cabinets and computer stations hummed under fluorescent lights. I approached the counter, explaining that I needed access to property and zoning records for Timber Ridge lakefront. The clerk, a woman with sharp glasses and a sharper tone, eyed me carefully before handing over a stack of folders and pointing to a terminal. Hours slipped by as I sifted through deeds, permits, and zoning maps. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Timber Ridge had been established decades earlier as a mixed-use community, which meant cabins like ours were legally grandfathered in as dwellings. Karen's claim of unauthorized occupancy wasn't just weak, it was fabricated. But the real discovery came buried in the meeting, minutes of a county planning session from 15 years ago. The Timber Ridge Association had filed an amendment to restrict certain dwellings, but the county never ratified it. Karen had been wielding that unapproved amendment as if it were law, using it to fine and threaten residents who didn't know any better. She hadn't just bent the rules, she'd built her power on a foundation of sand. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair, the folder open in front of me. My pulse hammered with a mix of anger and relief. This was the crack I'd been waiting for. The record itself, stamped and sealed, was proof that her notices were nothing more than empty threats. A clerk walked by, glancing at the spread of papers on my desk. "You finding what you need?" she asked casually. I nodded, sliding the most important documents into the copy request pile. More than I expected. By late afternoon, I carried a thin manila envelope under my arm. The kind of envelope that could tilt an entire community back on its axis. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt sharper, cleaner, for the first time since Karen had set her sights on us. I wasn't just reacting, I was moving forward. Driving back up the winding roads, I thought of Emily waiting on the porch, her hands resting on her belly. I thought of Matthew in his guardhouse, shoulders sagging under unspoken guilt. And I thought of every neighbor who had whispered warnings to me, their voices brittle with fear. Back at the cabin, I spread the certified copies across the table for Emily to see. She traced her fingers along the official seals, her eyes widening as she read. "So all of this, none of it was legal?" "Not a single notice," I said. "She's been bluffing for years, and no one's called her on it." Emily let out a shaky breath, sinking into the rocking chair. The relief in her face was matched by a deeper tension, because she knew what I knew. Exposing Karen wouldn't just be about us. It would drag the entire community into the fight. I slid the envelope back together, sealing it with a quiet finality. This wasn't just evidence, it was the first weapon I could wield in court, undeniable and irrefutable. As night fell over Timber Ridge, the crickets rose again, and the rocking chair creaked in steady rhythm. I sat on the porch steps, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. In my hands, I held the proof that Karen's empire wasn't built on law. It was built on lies, and lies, once brought into the light, had no place left to hide. The documents from the county sat inside the manila envelope, tucked beneath my arm like a lifeline, as I made my way to the Timber Ridge board office. It wasn't much to look at. A converted lakeside cafe, its windows shuttered with heavy blinds, a brass plaque mounted by the door. To the residents, this place was the heart of authority. To me, it was where Karen kept the illusion alive. I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old coffee and copier ink. A receptionist at the front desk gave me a wary look as I signed the visitor log. The walls were plastered with framed rules and policies, each one framed in gold, as if presentation could turn opinion into law. Behind the receptionist's shoulder, through the glass pane of a conference room, I spotted Karen. She sat at the head of a long table, her posture sharp, her hands folded like a queen presiding over her throne. Around her, 2 other board members shuffled papers, nodding at whatever she was saying. When she saw me through the glass, her expression barely shifted, but the slight curl of her lip told me she wasn't surprised. She leaned back in her chair, smug, waiting for me to make my move. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I walked to the bulletin board near the entrance, studying the fresh stack of violation notices pinned there. New names, same template. A kayak tied up to the wrong post. A shed deemed non-conforming. Lawn edges cut 2 inches too high. Each one stamped with fines and threats of foreclosure. I snapped photos again, my phone, buzzing in my hand with each click. It wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about building a map of abuse that stretched far beyond our porch. The receptionist's voice broke the silence. "You'll need to leave if you don't have an appointment." I turned, meeting her eyes. "I don't need an appointment to read what's posted publicly." My tone was steady, but my pulse thudded. The weight of the envelope under my arm was a reminder of what I carried, proof stronger than anything pinned on these walls. Karen rose from her chair, stepping out into the hallway. Her heels clicked against the linoleum, sharp as gunfire. She stopped a few feet from me, her smile practiced, her voice dripping with false cordiality. "Mr. Mercer? Collecting souvenirs?" I held her gaze, my jaw tightening. "Collecting evidence." Her smile faltered, just for a second. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice so the board members couldn't hear. "You think a few papers are going to stop me? The board follows me. The residents are too scared to fight. You can drag all the records you want into a courtroom. By then, you'll be broke." The envelope pressed against my ribs like a heartbeat. I didn't flinch. "We'll see." I left without another word, stepping into the cool air outside. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sharp realization of how high the stakes had become. She knew I was gathering proof. She knew I was building a case. And instead of backing down, she was tightening the screws. Back at the cabin, Emily sat by the window, rocking slowly. She looked up, reading my face before I even spoke. "She confronted you, didn't she?" I nodded, setting the envelope on the table. "She knows. She's not worried about the board or the rules. She's betting on fear and exhaustion to break us before the truth." Can Emily's hands pressed against her stomach, protective, steady. "Then, we can't afford to wait. You said every fortress has a pressure point. You've found it. Now you have to push." Her words cut through me, sharper than any rule Karen could draft. She was right. The evidence wasn't enough by itself. I had to commit, to act, before Karen's intimidation bled into something worse. I looked out the window, the lake glimmering under the night sky. The rocking chair creaked softly, a reminder of promises carved into oak and memory. This fight had shifted from paper to survival. And I knew then, without hesitation, that Karen hadn't just threatened a cabin. She had declared war on a family. On my family. The night after Karen's warning, sleep came in fragments. Every creak of the cabin pulled me awake. Every shift of Emily in the rocking chair tightened the knot in my chest. By dawn, I knew I couldn't sit idle anymore. The envelope of county records lay on the table like a loaded weapon. But a weapon is only as strong as the hands that wield it. I needed allies. So I walked back to the guardhouse. The lake fog clung to the ground, curling around my boots as I approached. Matthew Crane was there, as always, slouched in his chair, a thermos of coffee cooling beside him. His eyes lifted when he saw me, and for a flicker of a moment, I thought I saw relief. Then his gaze hardened again, defaulting to the wall of silence he'd built for himself. I leaned against the rail, not asking permission. "You were right. She's got the board wrapped tight. But what she doesn't have is the law." I slid the corner of the envelope out from under my jacket, just enough for him to see the county seal. I found the records. Her amendment was never ratified. She's been bluffing for years. Matthew's hand twitched against the desk. He didn't look at me, but his jaw tightened, his teeth grinding. "That doesn't matter if people still believe her," he muttered. His fingers tapped against the logbook, restless, uneven. Then he rubbed his temple, sighing through his nose like a man carrying a weight too long. "She used me," he said finally, voice low. "Told me I was protecting the neighborhood, keeping it safe. Said folks needed order, needed someone to enforce it." His eyes flicked up, and for the first time, I saw shame written plain across his face. "But last week, when she dragged me along to your place, when she shoved that notice at your wife, I saw her flinch. Your wife, pregnant, scared, and still. She tried to stand her ground. His throat worked as he swallowed. That's not order. That's cruelty." The words cracked out of him like a confession he'd been holding too long. His posture shifted, the rigid sheriff's frame sagging as if admitting it, stripped away the armor he'd worn. He leaned back in the chair, hands clasping together, knuckles pale. I said nothing, letting him speak, letting his conscience do the work. "She's kept this going with fear," Matthew continued. "She told me years ago that the amendment was approved, that the county backed it. I never checked. I trusted her, and every time she handed me a notice to deliver, I told myself it was just procedure." He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing at some distant memory. "But I've watched families pack up overnight. I've watched men break under the weight of fines they couldn't pay. And all the while, I stood there in uniform, giving it weight it never deserved." The silence stretched. I could hear the faint hum of cicadas rising with the morning. Then Matthew leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You want the board to hear the truth? You'll need more than paperwork. You'll need someone who's seen it up close, someone who's carried out her orders." I studied him, the slump in his shoulders, the twitch of his foot tapping against the floor. He was breaking open right there, the guilt pouring out in fragments he couldn't hide. "Are you saying you'll back me?" I asked. He didn't answer, directly. Instead, he pulled open the desk drawer, retrieving a stack of carbon copy slips, records of every violation he'd ever delivered. He flipped through them, his fingers lingering on certain names, certain dates. "These aren't supposed to leave here," he said, his voice tight. "But I can tell you which ones were real complaints and which ones she fabricated. She made me write false logs, made me sign them." He shoved the stack back into the drawer, slamming it shut. His hand trembled as he gripped the edge of the desk. "If this comes out, I lose everything. But if I stay silent, I'm no better than her." His eyes finally met mine, steady now, stripped of pretense. "So, when the time comes, Daniel, you won't be alone." I walked away from the guardhouse with the morning sun breaking over the lake, the fog burning away. The envelope under my arm carried the weight of the law, but Matthew's words carried something heavier. Testimony. For the first time, Karen's fortress had more than cracks. It had a witness from inside its walls, ready to speak. The fog had lifted by the time I reached the cabin, sunlight spilling across the lake in shards of silver. I carried Matthew's words with me, heavier than the envelope tucked under my arm. Testimony, the one thing Karen couldn't counterfeit. If he stood up, if he told the truth, her fortress of rules would crumble in front of everyone. Inside, Emily was at the kitchen table, her hands folded around a mug of tea. She looked up, scanning my face the way she always did, reading the outcome before I could speak. "Something shifted," she said quietly. "Matthew," I replied. He admitted it. She made him enforce notices he knew were false. He's ready to talk. Emily's shoulders dropped with a mix of relief and dread. "That puts him in danger. And us." I sat across from her, laying out the documents on the table, smoothing the pages like blueprints. "We're past danger. This is strategy now. The records prove her amendment was never ratified. Matthew proves she knew it and used it anyway. Together, that's more than defense. It's a strike." She nodded, her fingers tracing the county seal on the page. "So, what's next?" That was the question that had followed me since Karen first shoved her notice against our door. What was next? Running had never been an option. Fighting blind had been suicide. But now, with evidence and testimony, the pieces formed a plan. The following afternoon, I set up at my workshop, the shed behind the cabin where I stored tools and drafting boards. Blueprints covered the walls, sketches of bridges, floor plans, and load charts from projects I'd built. I cleared a space, pinning Karen's notices on one side and the county documents on the other. Between them, I drew connecting lines, dates, and arrows. It looked less like a courtroom case and more like an engineering schematic, But that was how my mind worked. Structures, patterns, weak points. The weakness in Karen's fortress wasn't just the false amendment. It was the dependency on silence. Every resident who'd been fined, every family who'd packed up under threat, they'd all left quietly. If even one stood up, her authority would fracture. If more followed, it would collapse completely. Matthew was the first crack. I needed more. I drove to the edge of Timber Ridge, where the houses thinned, pulling up at the Alvarez place. Their shed had been the subject of 3 violation notices in as many months. I found Mr. Alvarez splitting wood behind the house, sweat dripping down his brow. His eyes narrowed when he saw me, suspicion sharp. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, raising a hand. "I just need to ask about the notices." His shoulders tensed, the axe pausing mid-swing. "What about them?" "They're not legal," I told him simply. "I've got county records proving it, and Matthew Crane admitted Karen forced him to deliver false logs." His eyes flickered, the blade lowering to the ground. He didn't speak, but I could see it. The disbelief wrestling with the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally put words to the injustice they had lived under. I didn't press. Instead, I left him with copies of 2 documents, the county seal clear. "Read them," I said. "Decide for yourself." Back at the cabin, Emily was waiting, the rocking chair creaking as she leaned back, her hand resting on her belly. I told her what I'd done, how the plan was forming. "This isn't just about winning in court," I explained. "It's about showing people they're not powerless. If they see one person stand, they'll know they can too." She studied me for a long moment, then whispered, "Promise me, you'll keep us safe." I crouched beside her, hand resting on the arm of the chair. "I promise." As night fell, I returned to the workshop, the map of notices and records pinned on the wall, glowing under a single bulb. For the first time, the structure of Karen's empire wasn't looming over me. It was laid bare, every beam exposed, every weak joint marked. The plan was clear, evidence in one hand, testimony in the other. Pressure applied at the right moment, in the right place, and her fortress would fail. I just had to hold steady until the strike. The map of notices and records glowed on the wall of my workshop, a spider web of arrows and signatures. For weeks, Karen had wielded those papers like weapons, but now they were stripped of authority, reduced to evidence of fraud. The only thing left was timing, choosing when and where to push. That push began at the Timber Ridge Library, a low, cedar-paneled building at the edge of the neighborhood. It was one of the few spaces Karen didn't control outright, though she had tried to. Flyers banning unsanctioned gatherings still hung on the bulletin board, faded from sun and thumbtacks. The librarian gave me a cautious nod as I spread my binder across a study table near the back. I wasn't here to read, I was here to prepare. The copies from the county clerk, Matthew's half-whispered confession, the photographs of notices pulled from the community pavilion. All of it had to be organized into a case that even Karen couldn't spin away. I built it like I would any structure. First, the foundation, the county's official stamp proving the amendment had never been ratified. Then the beams, testimonies, starting with Matthew, but also neighbors like the Alvarezes, who had read the documents I left them and were beginning to send quiet messages of support. And finally, the load-bearing walls, the pattern of notices, dates, and fabricated fines that proved Karen's campaign of fear wasn't just aggressive, it was unlawful. I leaned back, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. This was no longer about surviving fines or saving one cabin. This was about exposing the system for what it was, a facade held together by intimidation. And like every facade, the moment one brick gave way, the rest would follow. Halfway through the afternoon, the door creaked open. Matthew stepped inside, his presence heavy as always. He spotted me at the table, hesitated, then walked over. He didn't sit right away, just stood there, his hands flexing at his sides. "You're really going through with this," he said, not as a question, but a statement. "I don't have another choice," I answered, sliding a copy of the county seal toward him. "Neither do you." He finally sat, his shoulders sagging, his eyes fixed on the pages. "I've seen men lie on the stand. I've seen truth twisted until no one could recognize it. You're walking into a storm." "Maybe," I said, "but this storm can't be weathered by silence. The only way through is to face it head on. His fingers traced the seal, then stilled. "You know what she'll do when she finds out I'm backing you?" I met his gaze. "She's already ruined lives, yours included. But the difference is, this time you won't be alone." The silence stretched, then Matthew nodded, a slow surrender to the weight of his own conscience. It was the confirmation I needed. By evening, I packed the binder with every piece of evidence, sliding it into a black briefcase I hadn't used since presenting designs to city councils years ago. It felt strange, carrying blueprints of law instead of steel, but the principle was the same. Structures stood or fell based on proof, not perception. When I returned to the cabin, Emily met me on the porch. The rocking chair creaked as she shifted, her hand resting on her stomach. "It's ready?" she asked. "It's ready," I said. She studied me, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion in her body. "Then make sure they hear it." Every last one of them. I set the briefcase beside the chair, the sound of its latch clicking shut, carrying into the night air. Beyond the lake, the lights of Timber Ridge glimmered faintly, each one a household trapped under Karen's reign. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the preparation ended. The strike began. The briefcase sat by the door, its black shell catching the faint light from the porch lamp. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, feeling the weight of the documents inside press against my hand. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was the tool that would decide whether Timber Ridge remained under Karen's grip or broke free. The Timber Ridge Lodge loomed ahead as I walked up the hill, its log frame outlined against the fading evening sky. For most of the community, this was the place where they came to be reminded of rules, where Karen's voice carried louder than anyone else's. Tonight, it would become something different. Tonight, the silence that kept everyone in line would finally be broken. Inside, the space was arranged with folding chairs facing a long oak table at the front. Residents filled the seats in uneasy silence, their eyes darting toward the board members gathering at the table. Karen stood at the center, arranging her papers with deliberate precision. She didn't need to look at me to let me know she'd seen me. Her confidence radiated like perfume, thick and suffocating. I sat near the front row, the briefcase resting at my feet. Around me, neighbors shifted nervously, some refusing to meet my eyes, others giving the faintest nods of acknowledgement. They all knew why I was here, even if no one dared say it. The meeting began with Karen's familiar tone of authority, smooth and controlled. She spoke about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood, her words polished to a shine. Each item passed without objection until she reached the one that mattered most. Violation, review, Mercer residence. Her eyes finally locked on mine as she said it, her lips curling into a smile that was more threat than courtesy. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "would you like to address the board regarding your unauthorized occupancy?" I stood, picking up the briefcase, and walked to the podium. The wood felt cool beneath my hands as I set the documents down. Karen leaned back in her chair, arms folded, as though indulging a child who didn't know better. "I'll be brief," I began, my voice carrying through the hall. "The Timber Ridge Association has been enforcing fines and threatening foreclosures for years, based on an amendment you claim was approved by the county. But here's the truth." I opened the folder, holding up the certified county record. The seal glinted under the overhead lights, undeniable. That amendment was never ratified. Not 15 years ago. Not ever. Which means every notice, every fine, every threat built on it is invalid. A ripple moved through the crowd, whispers spreading like sparks. Karen shifted in her chair, her smile faltering. One of the board members glanced nervously at her, as if realizing they'd been following a ghost of authority. "This isn't just about my cabin," I continued. "It's about every resident who's been forced to pay, every family who's been intimidated into silence. What's been passed off as law is nothing but a lie." Karen slammed a hand against the table. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice cracking for the first time. "You're misinterpreting technicalities. The board has full authority to—" But before she could finish, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Matthew Crane stood near the back, his shoulders rigid, his face pale. All eyes turned toward him as he cleared his throat. "I enforced those notices," he said, his voice heavy, deliberate. "I delivered them, logged them, and signed off when I knew they weren't right." Karen told me the amendment was valid. I believed her. But I saw the fear on people's faces when I knocked on their doors. I saw families leave overnight, And last week, I saw her shove a notice at a pregnant woman like she was nothing. Gasps filled the room. Karen froze, her face paling as Matthew's words sank in. For the first time, the fortress cracked, not from documents, but from testimony that no one could ignore. I laid the documents flat on the podium, my voice calm, steady. The law is clear. The truth is clear. The only question left is whether this community still belongs to fear, or to the people who live here. The room fell into silence, the kind that wasn't submission, but awakening. The board shifted uncomfortably. The neighbors stared, their eyes wide, their silence no longer the silence of fear, but of possibility. The confrontation had begun, and Karen's empire was no longer untouchable. The silence inside the lodge stretched so long, it seemed the beams themselves were holding their breath. Dozens of eyes flicked between Karen at the board table, Matthew standing stiff with guilt, and me at the podium with the county records laid open like a blade. For years, this room had been her stage. Tonight, it was shifting beneath her feet. Karen rose slowly, the scrape of her chair against the wood floor sharp as a strike. "This is a smear campaign," she declared, her voice pitched high to cover the tremor beneath it. One disgruntled resident and one bitter ex-sheriff do not speak for the integrity of Timber Ridge. Her words hung in the air, but the crowd didn't clap, didn't nod. They stared, waiting, the weight of doubt heavy in the space she had once commanded. I lifted the certified record, the county seal catching the overhead lights. "This isn't opinion," I said. "This is fact." The amendment was never ratified. Every violation based on it is worthless. Every fine you've levied with it is theft. Murmurs rippled through the chairs, soft at first, then rising like a tide. I saw Mr. Alvarez in the back row leaning forward, his hand gripping. His wife's! I saw Mrs. Hargrove whispering fiercely to the neighbor beside her. Fear was cracking, splintering into something else. Anger. Karen's face hardened. She jabbed a finger toward Matthew. "And you? You were supposed to uphold order, not undermine it. You're nothing but a coward who couldn't handle responsibility." Matthew didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders, his voice low but steady. "I carried your orders for too long. I believed you when you told me the amendment was real. That's on me, but I won't stand by while you break this place apart. Not anymore." His jaw clenched, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "She's been lying, and I helped her do it. But tonight, I'm telling you the truth." The room erupted, not in chaos but in voices rising, overlapping, like a dam bursting. Questions, accusations, anger that had been swallowed for years suddenly filling the air. "She fined us for our shed. She threatened foreclosure when my husband was sick. How much money did you take from us?" Karen's composure shattered. She banged her palm against the table, shouting for order, but the louder she yelled, the less anyone listened. For once, her authority didn't carry. The walls of silence she had relied on for years were gone. I waited, letting the storm swell, then lifted my voice above it. "You've all lived under her threats. You've paid fines you didn't owe. You've let fear control you because you thought she had the law on her side. But she doesn't. And tonight, you've seen the proof I held the record high. The law is here. In writing, in fact, not in her voice, not in her intimidation." The crowd quieted, listening. I pointed toward the oak table where Karen stood trembling with rage. "She doesn't get to decide who belongs in this community. You do. Every one of you." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Mr. Alvarez stood, his voice cutting through. "We've had enough." His words were met with murmurs of agreement, then a wave of voices, growing stronger. "Enough! No more fines. She has to go." Karen's eyes darted across the room, searching for support, but the board members at her side shifted uneasily in their chairs. One of them closed his binder, avoiding her gaze. Another leaned away, lips pressed tight. Her power was evaporating right there in front of everyone. Emily's face flashed in my mind, her hands cradling her stomach, the oak chair rocking beneath her. This wasn't just my fight. It was hers, our child's, every family's who had been crushed by Karen's invented rules. I lowered the record onto the podium, my voice calm now. "This isn't the end, but it's the beginning of something better. A community where fear doesn't run the show." The residents rose to their feet, the sound of chairs scraping loud, determined. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. It was awake. The residents' voices still rang in my ears as the board meeting dissolved into chaos. Karen tried to shout above them, her voice breaking, but it was useless. People weren't listening anymore. They were demanding answers, turning toward one another instead of looking to her for direction. The fortress she had built on fear collapsed in plain sight. Within a week, the fight shifted from the lodge to the county courthouse downtown. The same stone columns that had once felt distant and imposing now stood as guardians of something I carried in my hands. Proof. Emily couldn't come with me. Her doctor had insisted she rest, but she pressed her palm to mine that morning, whispering, "Make it count." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, rows of benches polished smooth by decades of cases. Karen sat across the aisle, her face stiff, her lawyer whispering frantically in her ear. Matthew was behind me, shoulders square, his jaw tight but steady. The Alvarezes sat in the back row, and even Mrs. Hargrove had made the trip, her cane tapping against the floor as she settled into her seat. When the judge entered, the air shifted. This wasn't the lodge, where Karen could bang a fist and silence a crowd. This was a place where words were weighed against law, where documents carried more weight than intimidation. Karen's lawyer went first, speaking of community cohesion and standards of order, but his arguments cracked the moment I stepped forward with the envelope of certified county records. I laid them on the judge's bench, the seal glinting under the lights. "This amendment she's used for years," I said clearly, "was never ratified. These are official county records. Every notice issued under it is invalid. Every fine, every threat of foreclosure. It was all built on a rule that doesn't exist in law." The judge flipped through the documents, nodding slowly. Then came Matthew. His voice didn't shake as he confessed how Karen ordered him to deliver false notices, how he had signed off on logs she dictated. He admitted his guilt openly, but he also stripped the last shred of credibility from her. By the time Karen took the stand, her composure was gone. She tried to dismiss the county records as misinterpretations, tried to discredit Matthew as a disgruntled ex-sheriff. But the evidence was too strong, the testimony too damning. Each word she spoke only tightened the noose of her own making. When the ruling came, it was swift and absolute. The court declared every notice issued under the false amendment null and void. Karen was found personally liable for harassment and misuse of authority. The HOA board was ordered to convene new elections under county supervision. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom, but I barely heard them. I thought of Emily, of the oak rocking chair on the porch, of the child we hadn't yet met. We had won, not just for us, but for everyone in Timber Ridge. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered around me. Some clapped me on the shoulder, others whispered thank yous through tears. Matthew stood apart at first, but when I caught his eye, he stepped forward. "I should have done this years ago," he said quietly. "You did it now," I replied. "That's what matters." When I returned home, Emily was waiting on the porch, the rocking chair creaking gently beneath her. She looked up, searching my face. "It's over?" "It's over," I said. And for the first time in months, the cabin felt like sanctuary again, not a battleground. Timber Ridge changed after that. The new board was elected by the residents, not ruled by fear. Notices disappeared from the bulletin boards. Neighbors lingered on porches, their conversations no longer hushed. The silence that once defined the community was gone, replaced by something louder, stronger, trust. I still run my hands along the oak chair sometimes, feeling the grooves carved by Emily's father. I kept the promise I made, not just to him, but to her, to our child. And in that promise, I found something stronger than fear: legacy. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now. Share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.